One day, a donkey fell down a well. It kicked and brayed and made an awful racket until the farmer came out to see what was happening. And he looked down the well and he thought, oh, how on earth am I going to get the donkey out of the well? And he thought about it, and he just couldn't come up with a solution. So finally he said to himself, oh, I can get another donkey. The well's obviously dangerous. It needs to be filled in. So he called over some neighbours to help fill in the well. So he grabbed some shovels and started hauling the dirt on. Obviously the donkey realised what was happening and started up another racket. But they just kept on shoveling the dirt. Suddenly they realised there was no sound coming from the well. And they looked down and what they saw amazed them. With every shovel load of dirt they had thrown into the well, the donkey had shaken the dirt off, stamped the ground, and made the ground just a little bit higher. So this encouraged them to renew their efforts. So they poured the earth on, the donkey shook the dirt off, stamped the ground, until eventually the ground was high enough for the donkey to walk away from the well off to greener pastures. Now, I love this little story because for me, it epitomizes the will to fight against hopeless odds. I know all about hopeless odds. In 1984, I was one of the first 400 people in Australia diagnosed with HIV/AIDS. As I was plummeting down this dark well, I was overcome with feelings of disbelief, suffocating terror, guilt, shame, hopelessness. But suddenly, I stopped myself and said, I shook the dirt off my back and I stamped the floor and I said, no, this is not the end. You will not die from AIDS. So this became my mission. But no sooner had I made this brave decision than my doctor threw another shovel load of dirt on me. Because of the loathing and hatred in the community at the time for anyone with HIV/AIDS, as it was only known then, he advised me to tell only 2 people maximum about my diagnosis in case of repercussions. So, on top of being told I had a terminal illness, I had to be quiet about it. Eventually, I did tell 4 people, 2 close friends, and 2 family members. They, of course, were terribly supportive and kept my confidence. Now, my doctor's advice and the doctor's advice of many, many others was in our best interest, but unfortunately, it did set up a culture of self-stigma, which stayed with me for many years, until I finally decided I'd had enough, and I shook that dirt off my back and marched on. But sadly, for many others, it hasn't happened. And stigma is now one of the greatest fights we have in our fight against HIV/AIDS today. Back to 1984, I knew, like the donkey, if I was going to survive AIDS, I had to have a plan. To my naive layman's mind, it made sense to me that if the virus attacked my immune system, I had to keep my immune system as strong and healthy as I possibly could until such time that medical science could come up with a treatment or a cure. I came up with a plan. It was terribly simple. Healthy eating, exercise. I went to the gym 6 days a week and I walked everywhere. I became incredibly fit. I took up meditation. I meditated morning and night using a strong mantra, my immune system is strong and healthy. I used visualization. I took a piece of cardboard, about that big. In the middle, I put a black dot representing the HIV virus. Around the black dot, I drew hundreds of green circles representing my immune system, overpowering the virus. Around that, I drew 2 circles of red hearts, representing love. Love of life, love of myself, and love of my family and friends. Around that, I drew a big yellow band, representing the sun for health, strength, and happiness. Now this picture I put on the wall opposite my bed, which made it the first thing I would see in the morning when I woke up, and it was the last thing I saw at night when I went to bed. This imagery was incredibly powerful for me. I also started using vitamins and supplements. I did a lot of research, and there was no Mr. Google in those days, so I did a lot of reading. And it became a very expensive exercise, but I think worthwhile because I'm still here. And a lot of doctors now prescribe vitamins and supplements for people with HIV today. The last part of my little plan was the hardest part. I gave up alcohol. At a time when there was no hope, I delighted in forming an acronym out of the word hope. For me, hope meant H stood for humour. Because there was so much loathing and hatred whipped up by the media, I decided I would not buy any newspapers, I would not look at TV. I surrounded myself with laughter and comedies. O stood for optimism. P stood for perseverance, which I was going to need in bucket loads. E stood for energy, which I received from my little health plan. This little plan worked very well for me until I took a job in Melbourne, where I had another donkey in the world situation. The atmosphere there was hostile and toxic, and my healthy immune system, my CD4 count, which is the count they use to measure how strong your immune system is, fell from a healthy 880 to 220, just 20 short of having a diagnosis of full-blown AIDS. Naturally, I panicked. I rang my dear friend, the now late Dr. Brett Tyndall, a very good HIV researcher living in Sydney. He said, come back to Sydney and I'll get you an appointment with David Cooper. Dr. David Cooper, then now sadly the late Professor David Cooper. I came back to Sydney, I saw David, and we began our 29-year journey. This 29-year journey was a series of donkeys in the well. I started 28 HIV drug trials under David's dedicated and loving care. All of these drugs had hideous side effects. There were so many donkeys in the world situations, there were so many horrible drugs, there were so many horrible side effects. I can't honestly remember them all, but there are 3 drugs I'd like to talk to you about today and the side effects. The first is DDI. DDI came in a tablet form, about the size of a 50-cent coin and twice as thick. I had to take 2 twice a day. Now there were only 2 ways you could take it. You could put it in your mouth and chew it, an incredibly vile experience, or you could crush it up with some water and drink it, equally vile, and it left a nasty taste in the mouth. But worse than that, there was another shovel load of dirt thrown on my back because I couldn't eat or drink anything for 2 hours after taking the tablets. And by the time the 2 hours had expired, I felt so sick I couldn't even face food. And at the time, I was a national training manager for a large hotel group. I was traveling all around Australia and I had to fit in taking the tablets into my schedule. And as it turned out, the entire time I was on this trial, I lived off 1 meal a day, which was lunch. That was the only time I felt that I could eat something. Luckily, or I shouldn't say luckily, but I developed peripheral neuropathy. and peripheral. Does everyone here know what peripheral neuropathy is? No, but it's a very painful numbness in the feet. So David took me off the trial. So au revoir to DDI. The next donkey in the well drug was Ritonavir. Ritonavir was a double-blind trial, which meant no one knew who was getting the real drug or who was getting the placebo. It came in liquid form and tasted a bit like cherry cough medicine for a second. Then it left a nasty metallic taste in your mouth which never went away. So I took my first dose and trotted it out, and about 40 minutes later, I started to feel incredibly sick. I was hot, sweaty, my tongue had swollen up and was tingling, my lips were numb and tingling. I felt like I was going to faint. So I rang my HIV trial doctor and he said, you're on the real thing. He said, sit down, have something to eat, drink some orange juice, you'll be fine. He was wrong. The whole 2 years I was on this trial, those symptoms never went away. In fact, they got worse. I had migraine headaches lasting weeks, and it then developed into chronic diarrhea and vomiting, until it reached a point where I had no quality of life, and I had to stop the trial. Then, after I thought nothing could be worse than Ritonavir, along came the mother of them all, T20. This was a huge donkey in the well. T20 was a self-injecting drug, which surprisingly I didn't mind. But what I did mind was that the injection site could be a lump, either the size of a small fingernail or a fist. Either way, these lumps were incredibly painful. It felt like someone had a scalpel stabbing me all the time. I had every imaginable painkiller, nothing worked. For the entire time I was on that trial, which again was another 2 years, I was in agony. But to throw on another shovel load of dirt, the lumps, usually I had to inject twice a day, and the lumps would normally take between 4 and 5 days to subside. So you can imagine after 2 years what my body looked and felt like. One day I woke up and I really couldn't find anywhere on my body that I could inject that wasn't agonizing. So I called Dave and I said, David, I can't do this. I cannot do this anymore. So reluctantly we stopped T20. There were other horrible side effects as well. The peripheral neuropathy returned permanently. I developed lipodystrophy, which is horrible fat deposits around the stomach, which, as you probably see, I still battle with today. But the worst was a very rare brain disease called superficial siderosis, bleeding on the brain. This is a slow progressing terminal illness with symptoms a bit like MS. They know nothing about it, there's no treatment, there's no cure. However, despite all these setbacks and side effects, I continued with the trials because I had determined right from the day one of my diagnosis that I would do anything to help medical science find or increase their knowledge about HIV towards finding a treatment or a cure. This was one way I could contribute. Unfortunately, even with the trial drugs, my health deteriorated and I had to retire. But the donkey never stopped shaking the dirt off its back and kicking, stamping the ground. I was determined to win the battle at any cost. Thankfully, after many years of research, medical science came up with triple therapy. Now, triple therapy has worked extremely well for me. There are no side effects, and it has reduced my HIV viral load to undetectable. Today, after hundreds of international studies, medical science can now say with 100% accuracy that if someone has HIV, is taking the medication regularly, and has an undetectable viral load, they cannot pass the virus on to anyone. Not a cure, but a huge step forward. They've also developed a drug called PrEP, which taken daily can prevent a negative person contracting HIV. These modern medications are truly a miracle of modern science. And I'd like to take a moment here to pay tribute to a great Australian whose research helped enormously with these drugs. I'm talking about the late Professor David Cooper. David was a brilliant and tireless researcher who devoted his entire life to finding a treatment and a cure for HIV. He was also a wonderful doctor and became a close friend. He not only saved my life, but he literally helped save the lives of millions of people around the world. His contribution to humanity is immeasurable. Now you might say, oh great, we've got these drugs now, crisis over, donkey can walk out of the well, go into the green pastures, no trouble anymore. Well, yes, in a way, you're right. But people living with HIV and people more recently diagnosed do face the enormous hope of living long lives, just like anyone else. Except, even donkeys in the well donkeys living in green pastures get old. What then? This is my current donkey in the well, and for many, many others. Many long-term survivors of HIV, aging with HIV, are living on pensions and neither have the funds or provisions to pay for long-term aged care. As you all know, as we age, there are inevitably health problems. Except with people for HIV, particularly long-term survivors, there are more complications. Firstly, most HIV long-term survivors are gay, and they face concerns about going into aged care where their lifestyle is either understood or at worst they face discrimination. Secondly, all long-term survivors of HIV have complicated medical needs. They will need skilled, trained nurses who can recognise these needs and deal with them. Speaking for myself, I have a legacy of complicated health issues. HIV is no longer an issue for me, ironically, but I do have the complications from the drug trials still living with me. I look and feel healthy at the moment, but there's no guarantee that that may last. The superficial siderosis may kick in any time and substantially reduce my mobility and independence. So the big question is, where do we go? What do we do? Who do we speak to? I don't have the answers to those questions, but I do know that my dear friends at the Bobby Goldsmith Foundation are acutely aware of the problems looming over people aging with HIV. The Bobby Goldsmith Foundation is a charity who has been supporting the HIV community for over 30 years, and they've been tremendously helpful to me as well. I know that they're actively looking for solutions and networks to help support people aging with HIV. But they can't do it alone. This donkey in the well needs lots of creative people with visionary ideas and boldness to help the poor old donkey who no longer has the strength to fight. I know that the brilliant minds are out there who can help come up with these solutions. Because, like I have for the past 35 years, I always will live in hope. Thank you.
Thank you. That was remarkable, David. A remarkable story of courage and resilience and fortitude, but also for all of us in the room, a call out to how we can, as providers, help people in similar situations to David as they enter our facilities and home care services. So thank you. Thank you very much. I'm going to call now for questions. Is there anybody who, David, just stay for a minute.
Sorry. I thought you were keeping me off the stage.
No, I'm not. I'm just thanking you.
Thank you.
Is there anybody here who has any questions for David? Particularly around how you might want to support people with who have similar stories, perhaps people who are potentially facing discrimination within your services, or potentially around the complex medical needs that people in this situation might have. Anything there? Actually, then why don't I throw that over to you? David, how would you suggest that providers actually set about putting in place practices to support people in their services who are gay and potentially might be worried about being discriminated against?
Well, I think that people need to talk to people who are aging and who are gay, and to find out what their needs are, because we all have different needs, and our lifestyle is probably very similar. But we need to talk to you people, and you need to talk to us, so we can find common grounds where we can, I guess, work together so that we don't find the discrimination and we're not discriminated against, but we also manage to fit in with the lifestyle within the aged care facility. So I think that the communication is the most important thing, two-way communication.
So a further call, any questions for David? Okay, thank you, David.
Thank you.
So our next speaker this morning is Dr. Robert Dew from Peripheral. Robert is an innovation management consultant with over 15 years experience